Hello world of YouTube, and welcome to a video that has been interesting to try and make because I originally filmed half of this like 6 months ago when my beard was better kept and my hair wasn't as long, but that's all footage that's just down the drain now because I feel like I can't make that half without juxtaposing it harshly with this half, and I've rearranged this list. And it's a list that I've been dwelling on a lot. And it's a list that I wanted to make earlier in the year, but 2020 just burnt out list videos for me because I was doing the whole decade in wrap up. And even as time has gone on, there's at least one of those that I'm not really happy with, but that's beside the point. That's a video for another day. Today, I'm going to be making the musical sort of parallel to the games that need remastered list, albums that need remastered, because in the music community, remastering is a process that some people aren't the biggest fan of. There's some records that even I don't think really needed remastered to begin with because the production sometimes feels so indebted to the era that it was recorded. Sometimes it's so perfect the first time that a remaster just feels completely pointless and just feels like they repackaged it just for an anniversary release. When there are records that have fundamental flaws that a nice little production touch-up can fix. You know, if you get the stems of a record and you tool with, you know, plugins or you know, shit like EQing and compression, you can make a different sounding record. You know, if you remaster it, if you give it a different kind of sheen, you can make it sound better. And even in some instances, as I'll talk about in this list, make it fit better in context of a band's discography. And there's some records that I'll talk about today that I don't think necessarily need the remaster to replace the original, like in Rush's Vapor Trails, where that record had fundamental production issues that were fixed in its re-release. But I do think that in some of these instances, especially the ones higher up on the list, that is very much the case. And I'll go over which sort of fit in that place. Some would be just an interesting experiment that you can have in tandem with the original mix. And the higher the list goes, you'll kind of get a feel for it. But these are 11 records that I feel like could use a good repolishing that don't currently have one. And why? Now, like I said, Earthling is actually a great David Bowie record production-wise. It has that glammy sheen that I like from Bowie projects, and it has its own experimental electronic nuance that I feel very indebted to its era, but I don't think make it feel all that dated. I more just am curious to hear a remaster for this project, to hear how melding the electronics with the ideas Bowie was toying with would sound in a sort of retouching up. I actually really like Earthling. I think it's a slept-on Bowie release, IMO, and this is why it's at the bottom of the list, because it's the one instance where it's not necessarily in dire need of a remaster, but I do think it'd be cool to hear how the electronic sounds would feel less juxtaposed against the non-electronic elements that Bowie's toying with. I think it'd be cool. At least cool, as like a point of an interesting dive into, to see like a modern producer, or even someone like Trent to put his own modern touch on remastering a record like Earthling. You know, somebody who knows Bowie, knew Bowie, knew his visions, and knew what he was aiming for with the project, pulling it together and sort of retooling it in a modern sense. I feel like it would be really cool, and it could even make some of the colder aspects of the record that much colder when melded even more so with the sonics on the project. Again, it's a great record. I think it's one of the more underrated projects in his discography. It's a great record, one of my favorites in his discography. But it's at a point, it's a curious thread that my mind wouldn't let go of when creating this list. So I figured I'd throw it in on the bottom. Now, for the next couple of releases, I will be talking about similar ideas but in a different way, and that's more taking a record that has an okay production. It just has that early album rawness that I feel like a remaster would do a good job at putting it into the band's current, or what the band's sound would become once they got more production. And given Waking the Fallen has its own remastered, I'm kind of curious how Sounding the Seventh Trumpet would sound with a remaster. Something to give those guitars a bit more crunch, let those vocals kind of sit in their own pocket in the mix, a little more full, give those drums a lot more punch, because the drums on Sounding the Seventh Trumpet are really good, but I feel like because it has that raw first album feel, they feel a bit neutered in the mix, and given that the Rev, especially as they became more popular with their City of Evil and self-titled records, it'd be cool to hear this record get that same level of treatment on the production front. Give them that sort of sheen that their popular records had, while letting the aggressive moments that feel more vocally charged stand out and fit in the mix in a very different way. It would be a meeting of the worlds that I think would work incredibly well, at least as, again, an interesting point in the discography. This is another one of those where you don't necessarily need a remaster, but it could use one. It could use a good polishing up, just to hear how it would sound with the more modern or popular production styles that went into their more popular records. Because some of the guitar soloing definitely has that similar sound, or at least similar vibe that their more popular stuff would have. It just has that rawness that I think would sound really neat with a bit of a sheen cast upon it. And Adrenaline is something of a similar ilk, because, again, the Deftones, especially when you're looking at Adrenaline versus Around the Fur, which I talked about in my reformatted discography review, which went live this month. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But this record's guitars especially have a little more dryness to them, that even on Around the Fur, they seemingly mastered the art of making that reverb and that shoegazy sound fit the vibe of that record, that I feel like would be interesting to hear on Adrenaline. Plus, I feel like Chino's vocals across the board just kind of need a bit of a touch-up. They're really flat on this release as far as like sitting in the mix, and that very much feels, again, similar to Sounding the Seventh Trumpet, like that debut album rawness, that I don't think is a detriment to Adrenaline. I do think it is a little bit more in Adrenaline's detriment than it is Sounding the Seventh Trumpets. But I feel like it's still fine. It's serviceable. It's servable in its current state. But I think it could be an interesting idea to give this album a remaster, retool some of the sonics, give it a little bit more beefiness, and sort of give it more of a foundation that would make sense for a record like Around the Fur to burgeon from. I think, again, this does a great job at doing that in its own regard, but I feel like it would be interesting to hear a remaster of this project, if only because the tunes here are good, but even on tracks like Engine Number 9, where that bass is going, it would be cool to hear that bass pop a little more, hear those drums have a little bit more punch to them in the same vein that they did in Around the Fur. Just overall general beef-ups in production that I feel like would suit the band's sound in general, especially in that time, but overall let it more cohesively tie into their discography. It's understandable why this got them exposure, because the songs are tight, and they don't necessarily feel too askew from the general scene, but again, just would be kind of cool to hear. Now, this is the first record that I feel like definitely needs, like, a good sort of attunement. Lesser so than another record that I'll talk about higher up on the list, because I could see your average music listener, your average Chili Peppers fan, maybe, not necessarily being turned away from some of the productionisms on this, but this is sort of, to a lesser degree, of a similar ilk that like a Vapor Trails, or another record that I'll talk about that's infamous in the music scene for having this overproduced sound. When I was in college, one of my professors actually used this record as an example of bad production, and I was really shocked, because again, I was a teenager. I didn't know. I wasn't like, oh yes, the production is so very in line with the trends of bad music. But he threw it on. He had us focus on the points on certain tracks, like Scar Tissue was a track that he in particular used, where the guitar production was so unnecessarily overdone that I feel like a remaster would pull away some of that loudness warisms that aren't necessarily at as high in the forefront as they are in other projects. I can listen to Californication without having the same issues that I would have with like a Vapor Trails, but after being shown, after having the veil pulled away, it's one of those things that lingers in the back of my mind that it's insane to me that a record like this, that's a high-profile release, could definitely use with a remaster to touch up a lot of the overproduction issues that coat certain elements of it. Again, it's not as obnoxious as other records, and I can see the average listener batting an eye to it, not really paying attention to that aspect of the sound of this record, but having it being exposed to me, I gotta expose it to you. It needs a little retooling. Not as bad as some of the others, and it's a completely different beast than the last couple of records I've talked about, but something I had to get off of my chest right now. Again, I'll be referencing it. I recently did a reformatted discography review on Primus, and link in the description. And I talked about Green Naugahyde having incredibly inconsistent production, whether it's bass tones that either fit so perfectly in the cut or standing out very obnoxiously in a very overproduced sort of fashion. This is more of a record like some other ones that I'll talk about, where it just needs a bit of a cleanup, something to make it fit a little more in line with some of the better, more well-rounded tracks in the track listing. You know, there's points where the guitars pop in a good way and everything gels in this nice cohesive fashion. The bass isn't obnoxious. The drums across the board have a really good produced sound, but it's more the guitar and the bass that need to kind of fit better into the pocket. You know, whether it's a bass solo that feels really neutered in the mix, or a bass riff that pops way too much. There's just elements where the compression feels like it's ramped up too far, or the guitars feel like they're just buried in the mix and Lair's trying to just play so he can be heard. You know, it's one of those where consistency needs to be key. Feels like it's a little inconsistent in ways that just need a little bit of a touch up. You know what I mean? Now this is a completely different experience because this is more of, it needs a remaster in the sense that all 4 discs just need to be put together in one cohesive experience. You know, Zyreka is the one Flaming Lips project where its presentation at the time held it back, but that presentation could be fixed with a little bit of modern production in the form of just lining shit up, cutting it where it needs to be cut, and throwing it on streaming platforms. If Spotify can put Green Day songs together that don't necessarily need to be put together, they can put Zyreka together in a way that makes sense and accomplishes sonically what the band was trying to pull together. For those who don't know what Zyreka is all about, it's a Flaming Lips record that comes together on 4 discs, and you need to play these 4 discs in tandem with each other at different moments, and it creates this sort of sonic experience, which is cool. And given how absurd the Flaming Lips are, I'm sure they would just put it on streaming platforms with each disc as its own album, so that you would have to get 4 devices together and play them at the right times. And also, when pulling together a project like this, you need to factor in that mixing it needs to forego whatever mixing was done on each individual disc, and you need to make them gel together sonically so nothing clashes. But still, that's the primary reason why I think it needs a remaster. In a digital age, records like this become relics of the past. I don't think Wayne is sitting there like, I need to keep this in itself. I think it's just one of those projects that's got left in the dust because the Flaming Lips are always trying to push bounds and do weird shit sonically. But I think it would be cool if for like an anniversary or something, the guys just came together in a production studio. I don't think it would be too unheard of to maybe give it a little polish, but also just keep it, get it all organized together, put it on streaming, and make it an experience. You know, I think it'd be cool. So I said this in another review linked in the description, and I referenced this video that wasn't even finished yet in that video, but when I reviewed Cult of Static, I talked about this album just overall needing production touch-ups. Guitars sounding too flat, Wayne's vocals sounding way too much like a bark because the production feels so sharp, and generally just making the electronics pop better. For a band whose whole sound was centered around integrating electronics into their heavy music, it sounds the laziest on here. A lot of the production sounds, again, sound very flat. It just sounds very gray, a lot of the sounds in this project. And I feel like just getting in the studio, polishing that shit up, making them pop in their own ways, whether it be throwing different production, different EQing, different, again, compression on stuff like vocals and guitar from each other, giving those electronics just their own better textures, you can create a better listening experience with this project. It's still more than likely one of the weaker parts of their catalog for reasons that have nothing to do with production, but the production itself holds back some of the better ideas that the record may have had going forth, and that's kind of upsetting, because this was the last record that they dropped while Wayne was alive. But, yeah, it's an instance where it just overall has just fundamental flaws with this production that a remaster could easily fix in some pretty simple ways. I mentioned this when I reviewed it earlier this year, but Roux' Supervision is easily one of the most bafflingly produced records to drop this year. It's a record that I've actually liked less the more that I've revisited it throughout the year. You know, I like a lot of the sonic elements here. I like that she's trying to do this sultry, funk-laden, groove-centric stuff, but the production neuters all of those attributes, the guitars especially, like on tracks like Do You Feel and International Woman of Leisure, feels so whimpery in the mix that some good fucking compression and EQing to let it fit in its own pocket would just fit so fucking well. Let that guitar sing, baby. And speaking of singing, Ellie Jackson on this project feels so whimpery. While there's aspects of the production that I think are okay, like a lot of the percussion sounds, they're alright. They establish that dancey groove. I like when the bass pops here and there. But again, I feel like nothing has its own pocket in a way that stuff like funk needs to have. You know, taking a look at Twerp, one of my favorite funk bands, they know how to give stuff a pocket. Or even a band like Primus, who is on the heavier side of funk. They know, usually, how to let their drums, their guitars, their bass, all have their own succinct, distinct pockets that they'll sit in, they'll ride their grooves while riding together, and they give their vocals a spot to shine. And for some reason, this record just does not feel produced in a way that feels conducive to letting those elements shine. Again, the production on the percussion, fine. The bass, while I would like for it to pop more because it's funk, and a lot of that funk lays in how that bass grooves, baby, it also is in tandem where that guitar kind of adds a good backbeat for the drums to ride on and that bass to shine with. You know, and again, those vocals, if you're going to be sassy, if you're going to do some good belt work, lay some good compression on there. Let her delays hit a lot harder. You know, there's a lot of sonic components that baffle me with this project the more that I listen to it, and I wish it would, I hope, anyway, that it gets a good remaster to let a lot of the ideas that I feel like the band was going for shine. Because, again, while it's not necessarily the best iteration of this sound, I liked it better when Janelle Monáe did it a couple of years back. I can at least respect Roux for wanting to forge down similar ideas, and I feel like it would have come across a lot better had the production been handled in any sort of capacity like a record in this style should. And this is the other big elephant in the room when talking about records produced during the Loudness War and Rick Rubin's buttery touch on a mix. And Metallica's Death Magnetic, while having other issues I could see others having with it, as far as derivativeness and stuff like that. Again, I've recently talked about this and the other records on the Patreon, so I don't mean to reiterate if you have seen those reviews. But Death Magnetic needs a remaster. The snares, obnoxious. The drums as a whole are kind of muddy, but the snare on this record is fucking horrendous. The guitars have the same aesthetic of these drums, and that it's just this muddled pedal of noise, or this metal puddle of noise. You know, it's just a bunch of crunch. It's a bunch of crunch, and not the tasty kind. You know, and James's vocals I feel like they have to compete with some of those things that sit in the same frequencies. Rob's bass, it's fucking gone for a lot of the project, which isn't something new for Metallica. I also joked about that recently in an alternate take review, but this record, while I could see others taking issue with some of the other sonic characteristics of this, the production on this is just unnecessary for how extra it goes, for being as loud as it can be. It's another record like Vapor Trails that feels like a daunting listen, because the songs are long and they're produced like this. So it's an exhausting experience for the listener to have to be pummeled with these buttery sound bars that are exhausting. It's an exhausting experience that I don't wish upon anyone, for as much as I think that this record's okay. You know, I think a good retooling with the sounds, pull back, turn down, turn it down, turn it the fuck down. I don't even sound like a grandpa here, but turn it down. Scale back the fucking compression. You don't need to overcompress everything. Give everything its pocket. Let everything shine. That's the beauty of music, you know. And I'll talk about that in the next couple of entries. But in the entrance of Metallica, it's just too loud. You know, it's not like a clipping type of loud where everything just sounds mixed poorly and recorded poorly. It just sounds awful because it's exhausting, because it has too much, and it just needs a little less. Now, the next two are going to be very recent releases, and the records that I've talked about here and there on the internet, on the listening log updates. But Grey and Gold, again, is a decent batch of Baroness songs. You know, I talked about it may not needing necessarily redacted, but I could recant that statement. I could definitely do a redacted on it someday, but it would need a remaster first, because the sonic components of this record are a mess. Unlike Metallica, shit on here audibly clips. Guitars sound way too harsh in like a rough, distorted sort of way. Drums have such a muddling noise to them that, again, isn't the same as the machine gun snares heard on Death Magnetic. It's just poorly recorded, poorly produced. Everything just sounds loud in a completely different way that feels poorly constructed. You know, you look at Death Magnetic as this, you know, SpongeBob futuristic chrome-ass album. This is the dirty-ass slums of music. Everything is way too rough. The vocals even sound way too inconsistently mixed. That bass, even though it has a place to pop, it pops your eardrums for how much it clips and how poorly constructed it just sounds across the board. This is an instance like the next record where it's not like Death Magnetic, where it could just be scaled back, or like a Roux where you can scale things up and mix with some of the panning. This just needs a whole new round two in the production booth. This needs somebody to sit down, sit with these stems, try to tool them with them in a way, and give it the nice style that I feel like could have suited Purple and Yellow and Green, because it has similar sounds as those records while also expanding on their sonic character. Again, that bass has a lot of good sounds on here, but the producer just didn't know what they were doing, which is shocking because it's the same person that produced Purple. And while I could see people having issues with some of the sounds in Purple, it at least sounds more cohesive than this. Everything on here is a mess. And it's upsetting because, again, I like the songs that are here. They just aren't fun to sit through because it sounds like ass. and needs a good pass through the mixing.
Also, because there's like a mix of ambient and energetic tracks, it creates a juxtaposition, because the ambient tracks, because they're not as flashy, the bad production doesn't stick out as much. So again, just making it even will make it an even experience for people, I feel like, you know?
I said this in my review of Cause I Love You, but it's saying something that a lot of the big hits to stem with Lizzo when she blew up around the time of this record's release weren't records recorded during this era. They were songs recorded prior from a completely different producer. Because while I like songs on here, the production is so bad, and they did Lizzo dirty. You know, because Lizzo is a powerhouse. She is a powerful fucking vocalist. And there's moments of it on the record. And they didn't know what to do with her. But even in instances where she's not using her power, like on a Juice or like a Tempo, it's still handled with the same style as like the title track. And it leads to this inconsistent tone with the mixing that feels like it's making up for the vocals in a way that wouldn't be the case if you knew what the fuck you were doing with a voice like Lizzo's. You know, and it leads to, because of the handling of Lizzo's voice, the rest of the sounds feel a little more slapdash, if that makes any sense. You know, I feel like the pocket for Lizzo isn't clearly defined, so the rest of the band doesn't really, it sits in this ambiguity that hinders the record as a whole. And I feel like because there are so many bops and so well-constructed tunes here, this is the biggest sort of travesty on the list, because Lizzo was done dirty by her production team. They didn't know what the fuck they were doing, and this record that I think could have easily been an 8 on my list. I like a lot of the writing. I like a lot of the hook work. I like the sonic ideas she explores on this record, you know, but it needs, like Golden Gray, it needs just another pass in the mixing booth. It needs a producer behind the helm that knows how to handle her voice and knows how to make it fit in the different mixes and styles that she's going with, and gives those sounds a foundation to let them pop. You know, whether it's EQing, panning, whatever you gotta do. It just overall needs another pass in the mixing board, and it is why it is the biggest album, the album in the most need of a remaster that doesn't have one. And that is my list. What did you think about it? Did you like it? Did you not? Let me know in those comments down below. If you did like it, be sure to give it a like. What are some albums you would like to see remastered that don't have a remaster that I didn't talk about? Let me know down there as well in the comments down below. If you want to see more of my music, gaming, and general nerdery content, be sure to subscribe. I'm gearing up for the end of the year, so this week I'm going to have nothing but music stuff, as I said in my post that I made yesterday morning. I got this Rush tribute listening log. Next week it's going to be list week, so I'm going to have a whole lot of stuff coming out for you guys. Best albums, best songs, worst songs, best games, the whole smorgasbord coming out next week. I got a lot coming out the next week. A lot of good stuff coming, so hopefully you're excited. But I'm going to get out of here. I've been Valrack. If you want to take it a step further, by the way, support me on Patreon. Special thanks to my patrons. They're helping keep this ship going. You know, they're giving me, they're helping with polls. You know, I threw up a discography review poll. I got early access stuff going up there. I'm a year ahead on my reformatted discography review. So I've referenced it a lot in this video, but like, I'm literally the review that just went live this week, the last one for the year, is not going to be live. The YouTube cut isn't going to be live until December of next year. So I'm just going to keep staying ahead on that, and you're going to keep getting early content on that Patreon, on the Patreon side of things. So I highly recommend it. A lot of good stuff going on down there. But I'm going to get out of here. I've been Valrack. You guys have a good day, situations. And I'll see you another day.